It's called, I think what it's best to do is to read the poem first together, and then I can tell you about my experience with the poem. Factory of Souls by Eric Gamalinda. It takes just two people to bring the world to ruin. So goes the history of love. At the end of the day, we tally the casualties of war, victory for the one who gets wounded, released. You say it's time for a change, but I don't know to what end. Change being just the skin of some incandescent creature whose grotesque beauty is what we adore, whom some people call love, whom we venerate because it consumes us, morsels for its huge soul. My people say, don't look or you'll go blind. You say the end was always just around the bend. I say all we have is unconditional surrender to the future. So unreliable is the past that I feel compelled to leave unmourned the blind, relentless loves that may have scorched into our hearts the way saints accepted stigmata. My people say, look back or lose your way, or walk backwards if you can. So I found myself on a bus to New York City to lose myself completely. Past Hunter's Point, we hit the Factory of Souls, 1,000 tombstones whose subterranean chambers manufactured the silk-like smoke that we must feed to God. I don't think the world's ever going to end. I think it will go on, and we will be as nebulous as Nebuchadnezzar. Our lives not worth a footnote, our grand schemes no more than insidious whispers. All memories shifting like the continental plates. In the future, all science will finally come around. Genetic engineering, I've been told, will be all the rage, and we will be a super race in a world infallibly perfected, where trains run on time, love never dies, and hope can be purchased by the pound. They call it immortalization of cell lines. We will choose what will survive, our destiny made lucid. We will find the world contemplating itself, like the young Narcissus, one hand about to touch the pool, his body lurched towards that marvelous reflection. I suppose the human race has always felt compelled to desensitize its failures. My people say, to go unnoticed, you play dead. I myself may have chosen to forget a face, a name, some cruel word uttered carelessly, but not after all the harm is done, intending any pain. And many others may have chosen to forget me. It works both ways. My people say, nasa huliang pagsisi. Regret is the final emotion. It's what you see when you look back. It's what's no longer there. So I can say that I first encountered the poem back in 1994 when I was first discovering myself as a poet. I didn't know how to find myself as a poet anywhere, so I landed in New York City at a place called the Asian American Writers Workshop, and I volunteered a good amount of time there. And for one Christmas gift, the director of the program had said, pick any book on the shelf, which was pretty easy because at that point with Asian American literature, there were about 20 books on the shelf altogether. So, which shows you how much we've grown during that time in terms of diversity and literature. So I picked this one book, it was an anthology called Premonitions, and I stumbled upon the work of Eric Gamalinda, which to this day, most poets tell me that they do not know who Eric Gamalinda is, which is such a travesty because you can see the kind of work that he's producing. And at the time, I was so blown away by his work that I didn't know that he was actually living and working at the workshop. So one day he came through these curtains because we had these fabulous curtains for a performance space there. And I had a chance to meet him. I did everything that I could to have him notice me because I was so incredibly just wrapped up in who he was, and he couldn't care less about who I was because he was not interested in women whatsoever. But getting back to the poem, it's often difficult for me to find a most beloved poem because I love so many. But then I realized the reason why I picked this is because I'm very affected by my own stance and mindset as a reader right now. So the big elephant in the room is that we're present and most actively learning at a poetry festival while there's been an inauguration that's taken place for a new president of the United States. And that a historical women's march is happening in Washington, D.C. right now and elsewhere. And though this isn't a political discussion, my love of the poem is tied to my political self who reads the poem. So the self who is young, and I'm realizing the similarity among all the writers here is that we not only read, but we reread the poems. And each time we reread the poems, depending on what's even happening in our own lives, the poem is then changed. So my reading of this poem in 1994 is very, very different than the way that I read it right now in 2017. So if I examine the Factory of Souls, the first lines, I'm drawn to the words love as I am to ruin and war and victory. And the poem allows me to read it on the smaller domestic scale of two people that are falling in and out of love. But because I'm reading it today, I'm also seeing that it's two countries, factions, two systems that are possibly at odds with one another. And in this way, I think I was writing down Carl Phillips' words, a poem can be seen in so many ways. And in this way, I love the democracy of poems, that it can allow anyone at any time to step into the poem and have their own say with the poem. I've always also been drawn to this idea, too, of what the political poem is, because I'm imparting my own political stance within a poem. And I love to go back to this quote by Carolyn Forche. I don't know if you've ever read her beautiful poetry anthology called Poetry of Witness, right? And in that introduction, she makes some pretty important statements about what a political poem is. And she says the word politics represents more serious difficulties, particularly in the literary culture of the United States, where the word is most often applied pejoratively, that's not negatively, and where politics is regarded as a contaminant of serious literary work. Our poets, most especially, are relegated to the hermetic sphere of lyric expressivity and linguistic art, where they are expected to remain unsullied by historical, political, and social forces. I speak to you today as a rather contaminated poet, but my understanding of the political is in accord with Hannah Arendt's. To be political, to live in a polis, means that everything is decided through words and persuasion and not through force and violence. In Greek self-understanding, to force people by violence, to command rather than persuade, were pre-political ways to deal with people characteristic of life outside the polis. And I love her quote here, finally we are discussing the writer with a politics. And of this I can only say that it would be difficult for me to imagine a writer or an intellectual who would profess to be without one. So I love her stance on this idea of the political, because I think that we've been talking about it a great deal within our classroom, because no matter what is happening out there right now, this is still a matter of discussion. No matter what our views are right now, it's the poems that speak to us, that allow us that access. But I think the beauty, what I do in my spare time is I geek out by reading the interviews with poets. If I'm not reading their poetry, I'm reading their interviews as well. So I was able to ask Eric just about this poem, and of course, he didn't see it as a political poem at all. And so he wrote back to me, and I said, Eric, I just really wanted to get your feedback on this poem because I'm going to be talking about this poem. I just wanted to know what you were thinking when you were creating it. And he said, well, it sounds like a love poem, doesn't it? He says, a sad love poem anyway. I must have written it in 1994 when I first came back to New York. I remember who I wrote it for. The only way to deal with loss is to move on, and hopefully to move on to forgetting. But once you commit something to language, you commit yourself to never forgetting, or never forgetting completely. I relive that emotion now, even its urgency and depth, Language and time have translated that experience into something I can return to, but only as a changed being. Perhaps what a poem can ultimately offer is shelter, and also distance, and therefore also reprieve from the burden of remembering. Thank you.